found it better, it also takes out one slide in my presentation, which makes it shorter again. First of all, the title of the Congress, it's always nice to start with it. Business matters, I call my presentation, and business matters can be explained in English in two ways. First of all, business is important. Business matters to legislators, business matters in society. Eventually it's business that creates the jobs. Business pays taxes, it actually pays for everything that we can build and what the government can spend. But on the other hand, participation legislation, also business matters. Matters in the sense that it's important, it's an important matter to business. So in that sense, this title works two ways. My name is Erik Akse. I already got a short introduction, very well placed. I used to work in the Dutch administration, working on simplification of legislation, specifically focusing on the business perspective, like what kind of problems do business face in legislation, what kind of hurdles do they have. And then I went to the European Commission, working inside DG Internal Market on impact assessments. How do you formulate good legislation? How do you formulate smart legislation? So I was, till about half a year ago, the person that your colleagues in Brussels would go to and try to lobby. So I gave you the internal perspective of what might work, what worked not so well. So giving you the internal ideas behind it. If you talk about smart regulation in the European Union, it's a wonderful catch-all phrase. What does it actually mean? And the shortest way of explaining is it covers the whole policy cycle. It starts with the initial idea of an administration to work on legislation, to make an impact assessment on the legislation. It's about the political discussion inside the European Parliament and the European Council to come to a final result. It then deals with the implementation of the legislation by the different member states in the European Union. After it has been implemented and actually works on the ground, companies have to deal with it. You can have fitness checks, which means a quick overview, seeing whether things are actually going in the right direction. And later on, you can have a full evaluation of legislation. It is something that has been started in the European Commission about 2 or 3 years ago to really seriously think about it. It's 4 points that I mentioned here. If you take this process from start till end, it's about 10 years. An impact assessment, to make it properly in the European Commission, takes about 1.5 to 2 years. Discussing about legislation takes again about a year or two. Implementation normally takes 2 years because countries inside the EU get so much time to make the legislation work in their own systems. Then you wait about 3 to 5 years, and then you start evaluation. Which means from a company perspective, you have to follow the whole process. On certain moments you have to be really active, you have to be very close on the developments and on the discussions. On other times, you should at least follow what's actually going on and not lose it out of sight. If you look at smart regulation in the European Union, there are several characteristics in there. First of all, it's uniform, which means that impact assessment procedures, consultation procedures where companies and other stakeholders can give their opinion about legislation are governed inside the European Commission and also Council and others by very strict rules. So you know actually what you can expect, and you can develop a very clear and good expertise in how things are going. If you miss a point somewhere in the whole process, you might suddenly be confronted with a very nasty situation because you're too late. And something you can prevent that because there is a very clear uniformity in the whole process. There is also a lot of openness. And if I can compare it to a website, what can happen? If somebody wants to destroy a website, you have wonderful programs that give, so to speak, a death by 1 million clicks. The program just asks the website all the time to provide information, and therefore the website falls flat. I would refer to the European Union as saying that it's a death by 1 million documents. There is a flood of information coming out. It's studies, it's ideas, it's press releases. And there's so much openness that it's very hard to actually oversee. That makes it even more important to know what the general developments are and where you actually have to look at. And for a lot of companies, it's not just if you're in, for example, in pharmaceuticals, and not just the legislation about the specific medicine that you're preparing. It's maybe also something about animal testing, because that would affect the development of the medicines. There is a high degree of predictability. Uniformity of procedures, you know when something is going to happen. Maybe not on the exact day, but you will be able already now to say what kind of legislative proposals the European Commission will prepare in the second half of next year. Because I put it there. The predictability means that there's also responsibility expected from the administration point of view. Because if you would come in 2 years where a legislative proposal is already very far developed, and you say, I don't agree with part of it, I don't like a certain part of it, then the administration can also say, but we already told everybody 2 years ago that this proposal was coming up. So why are you only now in the process? It shows the importance of actually monitoring and following the developments in general. Smart regulation also means a very important role for stakeholders, including businesses. There are very strict consultation procedures. The European Commission, the European Parliament and others that want to get the information because they need the information to develop the policy, but of course also imposes rules and regulations on the stakeholders themselves. It's codes of conduct. We already got it from the American presentation in the morning. You have to follow a certain ethical standards to make sure that the administration takes your views into account. And smart regulation involves all EU institutions. And in the European Union there are a lot. You've got the Commission, European Commission, you have the European Council, you've got the European Parliament, and you've got several bodies below, you have the European member states, you have regional authorities that implement legislation. That means that you will have per case to determine who is important. Where do I have to talk on which level? There are some interesting dilemmas to smart regulation as such. Because if you want to prepare legislation properly, and you want to do an impact assessment, and you want to make sure that you know everything, it takes time. But politicians don't always have the time. There's a very nice example now with the financial crisis, where people say we have to modernize, we have to improve our legislation. And they want to do it within 6 months, within 3 months, within 9 months. And then the first reaction is, but do you know that you're actually doing the right thing? Because if you want to do the right thing, you need time to analyze. I mean, again, referring to a company process, you will not design a car within 2 months because you know the product will be worthless, will not be really functioning well. You might lose out on different things. But again, politicians would want to show something that they're actually delivering. It takes financial and human resources. It's very easy to ask for an impact assessment. It's very easy to ask for a general analysis from the administration on certain legislation. But you should also take into account whom you're asking. If you ask the politician, the person will say yes. But if you then look closer, it might be that within a ministry only 1 or 2 people are working on it. There's both a risk and an opportunity. If there are few people working on it, they might have too little time to actually deliver quality. But if there are only a few people working on it, they might also be very open to you if you come in and say we can help you with developing it. There is a certain analysis fatigue. If you have to study and study and study, if you have to analyze and analyze and analyze, people might eventually say it's too much. I just want to get further. I want to get to the legislation as such. That's something that is very hard to see when it actually kicks in, when it actually happens. But it's something you should have a look at. And of course, the dilemma in all legislative jurisdictions in every country, how do you balance good versus the bad? The negative effects versus the positive effects. Very often the negative effects can be very well quantified. You can put a price tag on it. We lose so many jobs, we create so many jobs. But environmental protection, how do you actually qualify that? It's not very easy to do. And I would I would even say that from a business perspective, it's sometimes even harder because you can quantify negative effects very well. While people on the opposite side, on the social NGOs, the green NGOs, very often go for the general feeling, for the gut feeling, so to speak, which might appeal to a lot of politicians very much, but are not as hard figures as a lot of companies can provide. If you talk about smart regulation, what is needed from business? First of all, it's investment. And investment, it's not just in money and cash and time, it's also very much in support. It's investment in understanding your opposite partner, and that's very often the administration, the civil servant doing the work, the politicians doing the work. It's a lot of patience, because if you ask an administration to change, if you ask them to set up impact assessment systems, if you ask them to evaluate legislation, it's very often something new. They're not used to it. And very often, from the citizen point of view or the company point of view, you ask the government and the government should deliver the next day. People are very impatient with what happens inside administration. That's my experience. But if you want to change the way that administrations make legislation, it takes really several months or maybe even years before things work right. I would describe it as designing a new car. If you want to design a new car, it takes about 5 years. That's what I've been told from a lot of people in the car industry. Because you have to think about the design till a lot of technical stuff in there. And the same thing is with regulatory impact assessment. And of course, it takes persistence. You have to keep the pressure up. Administrations are like super tankers. If you give them a small push, the super tanker on mid-sea will not move. But you have to give it a small push all the time, so that it eventually goes into the right direction. What makes a company a winner? First of all, awareness about developments. That you know in advance when you should act, more or less. You will not be able to pinpoint very specifically, but you should act instead of react. The moment that you see that there's a problem, the chances that you can change something are very low. And you will face that problem then for the years after. It's actions on the proper level. I see a lot of companies that target members of the European Parliament, that target commissioners inside the European Commission and go on the political level. That's definitely a level you should not forget. But a member of the European Parliament, a commissioner, is not writing the legislation themselves. They might not even be reading everything. And if you have a detailed issue, you should try to keep it out of the political level. And therefore you have to talk to the administrators, the civil servants inside, which in the European Commission have a lot of degrees of freedom. It's involvement in the process, acting as early as possible. That's very much linked also to the previous one. That the moment that you even think that there might be a development coming, you should already listen whether it will actually happen. When we had the big oil spill in front of the American coast recently, BP had a big issue there. You knew politically that in Europe people would start looking at offshore drilling and the safety of offshore drilling. So any oil company that wanted to prevent or make sure that things are happening the way that they can work with should have then already acted. Maybe not going there, or maybe even going there and tell to the European Commission, to the European countries, we should change it. We've seen a big problem, we should have a good look at the legislation here in Europe. Which means that you open yourself up to changes, and therefore you are becoming a very good partner in the discussion later on. It's very easy to have an opinion also. Everybody can have an opinion. But the only opinions that really count for a civil servant is the one of the minister, so the politician directly above, and members of the European Parliament. So if you can work those opinions, then you're doing a good job. If you want to convince a civil servant directly, you have to have data. And the data itself has to be reliable. Because you're working, if you're on that level, you're working with a trust relation. Also with politicians, of course. But with the civil servants, maybe even more so. because they are basing their decisions, a lot of technical decisions in the legislation, on what you provide. If your data is not good, it might still work. It might still get the right result, and people might overlook it. But if you're really making a very big mistake, or maybe even evidently lying about something, and it comes out, then all your work might be destroyed for the next 5 to 10 years. Because within administrations, people tend to move, and bad stories, people will not write them down, but people will tell them. So if you provide data, make sure that you're honest about it, that you can also tell where the weaknesses are, and that you can actually look people in the face about the value of it. Now coming to a specific topic in terms of administrative burden reduction and business success factors in the European Union, specifically starting in the Netherlands. There's very often a misunderstanding between administrations and business. You talk, or we talk, so to speak, different languages. It's different technical terms, it's different mentality within it, so to speak. Easily said, the business of business is business. That's making money. I don't know whether that can be translated very easily, but in English it works very fine. And the business of administration is making laws. It has been in the last 50, 100, last 1,000 years, the idea was to make laws. And that's a very different logic. It's not always about efficiency, it's about getting a law done. And for that, you need different procedures, and you have to relate if you want to be successful to those procedures. It's not regulation about mobilizing broad political support, because it does not really help you if impact assessment, legislative evaluation is a topic only of one political spectrum. Deregulation, better regulation is very often linked to liberals. And therefore people think, oh, it's about cutting legislation, it's getting legislation out. It's about harming the environment, it's about harming workers, it's about reducing our safety levels. The moment you get that in, the whole tool will become less effective, because it will be poisoned, so to speak, by these negative influences that people will put in there. Smart regulation needs involvement of top politicians. If you look at who is talking about smart regulation, about burden reduction in Europe, then it's the people on the highest level. It's the British Prime Minister, it's the German Chancellor, it's the President of the European Commission. You need to have the top in favor of the agenda to make sure that the administration below works with it and actually changes. It's keeping the message simple and tangible. And it's related also to promoting understandable tools first. Because if you want to improve legislation, what you can easily have within the first 2 or 3 discussions that you go a completely different direction. And that you have to have a focus. Impact assessment is like social sciences. There are concepts like, how would I say, political alienation in social sciences, but people already talk about for 50 years. You don't want to have that to happen, that people only talk about it. Action has to come. And I'm taking the example of administrative burden reduction. If you talk about smart regulation and legislation, a lot of people say there's too much legislation around. We cannot work anymore, it's bad for competitiveness. But how do you give legislation a price tag? How can you actually tell where the pains are? Of course, you always have to the discussion where how to calculate benefits. And also how to assess the effects on business. And how to get business reality on a desk of a civil servant. There are very little civil servants in general that go out and work in companies. How do you make sure that they, in their own working environment, understand what's going on? The choice was making the good not the enemy of the better. In the Netherlands, they started already in the 90s to say, okay, paperwork. We're only going to focus on paperwork because nobody wants unnecessary paperwork. The content and goal of legislation was undisputed. So if the goal was to protect the environment, we want to have the same protection levels. We would not change that. There would be an independent controller in Actel where I worked. And it's just like in the financial services, banks have independent oversight that look at the figures and the contents. How are you actually working? How are you developing? Are you going in the right direction? What we did at Actel, was doing that on a political level. He would go to ministers and tell them what would be going right, what would be going wrong. There was very clear targets for reducing 25%. The Netherlands already did it now 3 times. So the first 25% were easy, so the second 25% were already harder, with the third 25% you would really get, you couldn't escape anymore, so to speak. As an administration, you really had to change things significantly. There was a link to the budget cycle, and that for politicians is very important. What would happen is that the supporter, the main supporter in the Dutch administration, the Minister of Finances, would have, of course, annual meetings with his colleagues, and they would all come and say, we want money for our policies. And he would put administrative burden reduction as one of the issues on the agenda. That gave a very strong political incentive, which means if you say that you're not delivering on administrative burden reduction, I might say I'm not delivering on the money you want for your policies. I don't know how often that was played that hard, but already the fact that it was on the agenda and it was linked to the budget cycle, and the budgets of the different ministries helped enormously. And the focus in the Netherlands was on easy use, and not on perfectionism. And this is a presentation of it. I'm going to get the microphone now. Does it? Yes, it works, it works. Because I want to make sure that I can still talk into a microphone and present it to you. It's about getting business reality onto the desk of a civil servant to make sure that they understand. You take a regulation, a law, you take it in its entirety. If you want to change something, I had seen it in several cases, that business federations, companies would say this law is not good. But if you talk about the level of the law, you talk about a lot of effects that actually are coming from the law, also positive ones. You would only look at the information obligations. That's the second. Where's my red dot? There. It's the second line. So you would talk about things like getting a permission, getting a permit, about sending in statistics to administrations, data about the people that are working in your company. You would have a look and say, okay, how do the processes actually work in practice? And you would standardize them. And you would try to make them as detailed as possible. So if you go to a municipality and apply for a permit, you would say, how much time does it take to fill the questions? How much time does it take to get the extra documents that I need to send in? From there, you would look, who is doing that type of work in the company itself. And you would assess the person's wage, the first one. You would assess the number of the time that the person actually needs to do that. And then you would have the cost per activity, the price. Then you would have a look at how many companies, the number of companies it has to do it. And then you would have to look at how often those companies actually do it. And then you would have the annual administrative activity. You just multiply the wage rate with the time, with the number of companies, and the frequency per year. And then you get a number out of it. Euros, rubles, dollars, whatever, depending on the currency you need. And then you have the administrative burden. It's a very simple one. People say it's standardized, and yes, you cut off the corners once in a while. People say there's a rate of error of about 5 to 10%. But 5 to 10% of a billion, okay, I can live with that error rate. From this point of view, you can also then link back again to where you can simplify. If as a company you have to send in VAT applications every month, means on a yearly rate, it would be a 12. Would it be easier to do it 4 times a year? So you go from 12 to 4. The question is how it would influence the time, for example. If you want to make a distinction between the big ones and the small companies, then you affect the number. Maybe not all companies that actually have to fulfill this certain type of legislation. Maybe you can take out certain type of companies. If you talk about the time, I've spoken to several civil servants in the Netherlands, and that they field trips into to companies that actually dealt and worked with the legislation they developed and they wrote down. And they came back and they were shocked. Because they said, it was never my intention to actually set up a procedure that takes 5 days to comply with. So seeing what it actually did on the ground gave them a very good idea of how they should change the legislation. And if you take away the time, you can take away a lot of the cost. And then there's one concerning wage rate. A lot of legislation is too complex. If it's meant for people themselves, or you and me, to actually implement it, then why should we have a lot of external expertise coming in? And that's maybe very strange from a consultant as I am, and to other consultants here also, because you're selling a certain knowledge. But if everybody has to rely, or nearly everybody has to rely on external knowledge to fulfill with an information obligation in legislation, then maybe the legislator did actually something wrong. Or they're asking something that nobody can provide. This model, the results in the Netherlands, and I will go back to this one, first turn it out. The model itself got very interesting information now. First of all, only paper pushing, paperwork, was 3.6% of Dutch GDP. And 50% of everything that happened in the Netherlands in terms of paper in there. People don't like that. Nobody likes paperwork, so every political movement, in the Netherlands would subscribe to this. There was a very strong political momentum to actually change that. There were 3 consecutive reduction proposals. There was, because of the implication of European law, very strong movement to get it up to the European Commission, to the European Union, to make sure that there also in legislation they would make sure that it would be as efficient as possible, and they would use this model. And there was very strong justification for changing it. Because if you take away a lot of unnecessary work, I don't need to explain that to businessmen. Efficiency, you get economic growth. You can redirect people from bringing paper from one place to the other into R&D. You can get new clients. You can actually economic activity and therefore economic growth and labor productivity. And those things really push the agenda. This is an example of one very practical tool that inside impact assessment and preparation of legislation can really help. And where you also from the business perspective, the general business perspective can really push to make sure that things develop in a direction that's actually beneficial for you. These are our contact details. I'd love to talk about the subject, so maybe after this program, with a glass of wine or something else in our hand, you can ask me all day now, but only limited to 2 questions before. But if there are more questions, I'm still here in the evening. Thank you very much.
For the presentation.